The surprise test dilemma. The surprise test dilemma is a classic logical puzzle that deals with the interplay between foreknowledge and the element of surprise. It starts with a teacher informing their class that a test will take place on one day in the upcoming week, but the catch is, it must be unexpected. This puzzle forces students to grapple with the paradox of an event that's both scheduled and meant to be unpredictable. The scenario unfolds when the teacher announces that a surprise test will happen during the week. The defining rule is that students must not be able to predict the specific day. Using this information, the students attempt to deduce when the exam might happen. Their reasoning often begins at the end of the week. If the test hasn't occurred by Thursday night, then logically, it must be on Friday. But if they expect it on Friday, then it would no longer be a surprise, eliminating Friday as a valid option. Applying the same logic to Thursday, they figure that if the test hasn't taken place by Wednesday evening, Thursday would be the only possibility left, which again would make it predictable. This backward elimination continues until they rule out every day of the week. At first glance, this line of thought appears logically consistent. If no day allows for a genuine surprise, the students might assume the teacher's claim contradicts itself. However, when the teacher ends up giving the test, say, on Wednesday, the students are caught off guard, proving that a surprise was still possible despite their earlier reasoning. This apparent contradiction reveals the core of the dilemma, a clash between logical deduction and real-world outcomes. Although the student's reasoning seems airtight, it collapses when an unexpected test actually takes place. This puzzle challenges our understanding of foreknowledge and unpredictability, especially in situations where one seems to cancel out the other. The central message behind the surprise test dilemma is about the limits of our logical thinking when faced with scenarios that mix expectation and unpredictability. It makes us rethink how we predict future events and how such forecasts can conflict with the idea of surprise. Digging deeper, this puzzle opens a door into profound concepts like awareness, anticipation, and self-referencing logic. It presents a fascinating scenario where these elements intersect and generate an apparent contradiction. One significant idea here is self-referential logic. The dilemma involves a feedback loop. The student's knowledge of the teacher's statement directly affects how they reason about the exam. Since the surprise depends on their expectations, their attempts to anticipate the test actually interfere with the very surprise element that defines it. This recursive loop complicates logical deduction and leads to paradox. The puzzle also touches on epistemic uncertainty, a type of uncertainty rooted in incomplete knowledge. In this case, the students don't know exactly when the test will be held. Although their reasoning tells them to dismiss all possible days, the test still happens on one of them. This shows how incomplete information can lead to unexpected yet valid outcomes, even when logic says otherwise. Another psychological angle is confirmation bias, our tendency to seek evidence that supports what we already believe. As the students eliminate days based on their assumption that the test must be unpredictable, they're subconsciously searching for an answer that fits that belief. Ironically, this causes them to overlook the real surprise. Viewed through decision theory, the dilemma highlights the challenge of planning when unpredictability is a key factor. Logical strategies for decision-making often assume a stable, predictable world. But this paradox shows how such strategies break down when uncertainty and surprise enter the equation. To analyze the issue further, we can consider dynamic prediction models. These frameworks allow for updates based on changing information, unlike static models, which rely on fixed assumptions. The surprise test dilemma shows that fixed reasoning may fail when events are fluid and contingent upon perception. Altogether, these perspectives help us better grasp how expectations, awareness, and logic interact to create this puzzling scenario. The surprise test dilemma pushes us to question our instinctive understanding of foresight and the reliability of logic when dealing with uncertainty. On a broader scale, this logical riddle has philosophical, practical, and educational implications. It offers insights into how humans cope with surprise and uncertainty in multiple areas of life. Philosophically, the dilemma forces us to revisit the notion of knowledge and foresight. It implies that logical deduction alone isn't always sufficient to predict real-world events, especially when unpredictability is built into the structure of those events. Practically, the paradox has relevance in decision-making and risk assessment. In the real world, decision-makers often face unknowns and must stay flexible. The dilemma demonstrates the difficulty in managing expectations and planning for surprises, emphasizing the importance of adaptability. In education, the surprise test puzzle invites reflection on how pop quizzes and unannounced assessments are used. While they can encourage preparation and gauge readiness, this paradox challenges educators to find a balance between surprise and transparency in evaluations. It encourages a reconsideration of how surprise affects student stress, fairness, and learning outcomes. There's also a psychological component. Our expectations shape our emotional and cognitive responses. The surprise test dilemma illustrates how those expectations influence our reactions to unpredictability. This understanding can be applied to various areas, from relationships to business decisions, to better manage surprise and uncertainty. Lastly, this puzzle serves as a powerful reminder of the limits of logic. While logical systems are valuable tools for understanding the world, they can fall short in situations involving ambiguity or self-reference. The surprise test dilemma pushes us to go beyond traditional reasoning and consider alternative models for understanding unpredictable events. In conclusion, the surprise test dilemma sheds light on our struggles with knowledge, foresight, and unexpected outcomes. Through its blend of logic, psychology, and philosophy, it reminds us of the richness and complexity involved in trying to anticipate the future and the occasional beauty of being surprised. The loop of origin paradox. The loop of origin paradox, also referred to as the causal loop or ontological puzzle, puts our ideas of time and cause-effect relationships to the test. It appears in time travel stories where something, a thing or knowledge, is sent into the past and ends up being responsible for its own existence. This results in a cycle that sustains itself with no identifiable beginning. To demonstrate this puzzling concept, imagine a well-known example. A time traveler journeys to the past carrying a popular novel. This person gives the book to a budding young writer who reads it, becomes inspired, and eventually writes the exact book the traveler originally brought. In this chain of events, the book doesn't seem to have a starting point, it just exists in a continuous loop created by itself. The paradox arises from this self-referential sequence, where the outcome loops back to become the cause. This leads to a mysterious situation. Where did the book truly come from? It appears to have no origin, just circling through time endlessly. Grasping this paradox means diving deep into time travel theories and examining how they affect the concept of causation. Time travel, particularly to the past, introduces the potential for cycles where effects give rise to their own causes. Traditional physics views time as a straight line, from past to present to future. But this paradox turns that on its head, introducing a non-linear model where events fold back into themselves. This defies our basic assumptions of how cause leads to effect in a one-way flow. The loop of origin also brings up major questions about how things and ideas begin. If something can exist simply by being part of a loop, where did it really come from? This thought experiment pushes us to rethink reality itself. Can something exist without ever being created in the first place? Going further, the paradox urges us to examine what this means for our perception of causality and time travel. If such loops are possible, they may lead to strange and complex situations where logic seems to break down. For a deeper look, let's modify the example. Suppose a time traveler brings back detailed plans for an advanced piece of technology. The plans are handed to a scientist in the past who builds the device. That device is then used to send the same plans back to the time traveler. Again, the plans have no original creator, they just keep cycling. This example highlights how deeply recursive the paradox is. The machine and its design are locked in a time loop with no true origin. The presence of each depends entirely on the other. It questions everything we take for granted about creation, causality, and the direction of time. Such loops also raise concerns about logical stability. What happens if the machine design is slightly altered? Could that disrupt the loop, causing contradictions or breaking the cycle? It leads to questions about whether such self-sustaining loops can remain coherent and consistent. Another issue is the challenge this paradox presents to the foundation of logic itself. It proposes that some events might happen without any traceable cause, disrupting the principle that every effect must result from a prior cause. This cyclical causality completely rewrites that assumption. The paradox also nudges us into debates around free will and determinism. If all events are part of a closed loop, are choices still genuinely free, or are they simply results of the loop's constraints? If time travel is possible, and loops like these can exist, then perhaps some decisions are already determined by these cycles. As we keep analyzing this thought experiment, it becomes clear that it holds major implications for how we understand time and reality. The loop of origin suggests that time travel might not only be possible, but could lead to baffling, paradoxical outcomes. In its final stage, the paradox invites reflection on its broader impact. How do we reconcile our everyday understanding of time, logic, and existence with something that defies all three? One of its most striking consequences is how it forces us to rethink reality itself. If an object or idea can exist simply by looping through time, then maybe our belief in clear starting points is flawed. The need for a defined beginning might just be a limitation of our current worldview. This also reshapes how we view time. Rather than a straight, linear path, time may function in loops, cycles, or even intersecting dimensions. These alternatives can better explain the bizarre structure of time loops and the bootstrap-style paradoxes they produce. Causality takes a major hit as well. The idea that every effect needs a distinct, earlier cause is replaced with the possibility of mutual causation, where events exist because they sustain each other, not because one came before the other. This suggests that our classical views on cause and effect may need updating when time travel is part of the equation. Additionally, if such loops exist, they have enormous implications for time travel's feasibility. These loops might result in contradictions or lead to stable but inexplicable situations where something exists only because it always has. Another philosophical twist comes from considering the role of knowledge. If information can arise from a causal loop, who truly discovered it? The paradox makes us question how knowledge originates and whether some forms of information are just always there, passed around forever with no creator. To wrap it up, the loop of origin paradox is a fascinating exploration into the complexities of time, logic, and existence. It forces us to challenge core assumptions and pushes us to imagine a universe far stranger than we ever expected, one where cause and effect might circle endlessly, with no true beginning or end. The Heap Puzzle. Unpacking the Sorites dilemma. The Heap Puzzle presents a captivating and puzzling issue in our grasp of conceptual boundaries, definitions, and the idea of ambiguity. This ancient thought experiment, which has fascinated thinkers for generations, draws attention to how tricky it can be to establish clear-cut lines in situations where tiny, gradual changes make categorization uncertain. To truly understand this dilemma, we must delve into its historical roots, the nature of imprecision, and how these ideas come together in what we call the Sorites Paradox. This philosophical riddle takes its title from the Greek word soros, which means pile. It is commonly credited to the Greek philosopher Eubulides of Miletus, who introduced it while questioning when a collection of individual grains of sand could reasonably be called a heap. The standard version of this puzzle is expressed as follows. One grain of sand is clearly not a heap. If you add a single grain to something that's not a heap, it remains not a heap. Repeating this logic step by step implies that no matter how many grains you add, a heap never actually forms. The paradox becomes evident when we acknowledge that eventually a bunch of grains does clearly form a heap, yet, based on the previous logic, there's no identifiable moment when that change occurs. This absence of a definite tipping point questions our very methods of labeling and categorizing things. It also points to the challenge of how incremental shifts can accumulate into major differences. At the core of this dilemma is the notion of vagueness. Vagueness refers to situations where the edges of a concept are not well defined, creating uncertainty about whether something falls within that concept or not. In the case of the heap puzzle, the term heap is vague. It doesn't come with a fixed rule stating how many grains are needed for a pile to become a heap. This vagueness isn't limited to sand. It affects many common ideas and words. Consider adjectives like tall, wealthy, or elderly. Each lacks a universal threshold. If $1 doesn't make a person rich and another added still doesn't, when do they become rich? Similarly, if being 20 isn't old and turning 21 doesn't suddenly make someone old, when do they cross that line? The Sorites puzzle brings to light how vagueness challenges classical logical systems. Traditional logic depends on rigid categories and a binary framework. Every statement must be either true or false. But with vague ideas, this black and white model falters, leading to puzzles like this one. Some might try to fix the issue by proposing there must be an exact number of grains where a heap officially forms, even if we can't pinpoint it. But this solution is lacking because it overlooks the fluid transition between non-heap and heap. The problem sticks around because our mental labels don't always match up with the way changes unfold in reality. The implications of this puzzle reach far beyond piles of sand. It makes us reconsider how we speak, think, and organize the world around us. It questions whether every concept needs a sharp boundary or whether some ideas are simply fuzzy by nature. This leads to further inquiries about whether our usual tools for reasoning, like classical logic, are enough to tackle such fuzzy concepts, or whether alternative approaches are needed. This paradox has led philosophers to suggest different ways of thinking. One idea is epistemicism, which argues that there is a clear dividing line between a heap and a non-heap, but we just don't know what it is. According to this view, the fuzziness comes from our ignorance, not from the concept itself. So, every statement is still either true or false. We just can't always tell which. Another approach is fuzzy logic, which dismisses the idea that all claims are either true or false. Instead, it introduces shades of truth. In the heap example, a small pile might be considered 30% a heap, while a larger one might be 70%. This way of thinking better reflects our natural sense of gradual change and gives us a more flexible way to handle ambiguity. A third solution, known as supervaluationism, accepts that some terms lack sharp boundaries, but suggests we can still reason about them by imagining all the ways we could make them precise. If a statement is true in every such version, it's considered true. If false in every version, it's false. Otherwise, it's indeterminate. So, while we may not know where a heap begins, we can still make sense of the term by recognizing that some situations are clearly heaps and others clearly are not. The heap puzzle also sparks broader questions about how we define meaning. If so many of our words lack sharp boundaries, then perhaps a lot of our reasoning is built on loose, context-driven ideas. Some philosophers, like Ludwig Wittgenstein, have argued that meaning isn't fixed by rigid criteria, but by how words are used in everyday life. According to this viewpoint, heap is defined not by a number, but by how we use the term in conversation. This shifts focus from trying to set rules to understanding language as a tool shaped by use. Context also plays a big role in solving vagueness. What counts as a heap can depend heavily on the situation. A small mound might be called a heap while cleaning a sidewalk, but not when building a sandcastle. This supports the idea of contextualism, that meaning often depends on the setting. This view embraces language's adaptability and highlights how our judgments are shaped by practical concerns. Beyond logic and philosophy, the heap puzzle has serious consequences for real-world decision-making in fields like law, medicine, and ethics. Legal systems often rely on vague terms like reasonable or negligent. But these words can result in borderline cases, making legal interpretations difficult. The paradox warns us that minor, gradual changes, like grains of sand, can lead to major outcomes. In healthcare ethics, similar issues arise when terms like quality of life or terminal lack strict definitions. As a patient's condition changes gradually, it might not be clear when a shift occurs that affects decisions about treatment. This makes it tough for families and doctors to make clear choices, as what qualifies as acceptable care may vary based on values and context. Public policy faces similar challenges. When defining categories like poverty or risk, officials often rely on numerical cutoffs. But the Sorites Paradox reminds us these cutoffs may be arbitrary. For instance, determining who qualifies for financial help or who faces environmental danger often involves drawing lines that don't fully reflect the gradual nature of real-life circumstances. Ethical debates also echo this puzzle, especially when discussing gradualism, the view that small steps can lead to major moral consequences. A single harmless lie might seem okay, but when lies accumulate, when do they become unethical? The paradox forces us to ask, at what point do a series of seemingly minor actions cross a moral boundary? Environmental concerns illustrate this too. Tiny actions, like dumping a bit of waste, may seem harmless individually, but together they can cause significant harm over time. The puzzle challenges us to think about how our actions, though minor in isolation, can have serious cumulative effects. Some thinkers have proposed alternative logics to address this. Contextualism, as mentioned, sees truth as dependent on the situation. Whether a pile of sand is a heap may vary based on who's speaking and why. This lets us reason more flexibly, without needing one fixed answer for vague concepts. Another view is paraconsistent logic, which allows contradictory statements to exist together without destroying logical structure. In this system, a group of sand grains could simultaneously be and not be a heap depending on interpretation. Though it challenges our traditional sense of consistency, it offers a novel path through the paradox. This dilemma even has relevance for artificial intelligence and machine learning. AI systems often work by sorting things into yes/no categories. But when dealing with vague concepts, they may falter. Imagine an AI built to detect spam. It may struggle with emails that are borderline suspicious. The puzzle reminds us that machines may not handle fuzzy ideas as well as humans can. Ultimately, the heap puzzle reveals how complex and ambiguous our everyday categories truly are. By showing the difficulty of defining vague ideas, it encourages us to rethink how we sort, judge, and make decisions. The philosophical responses, epistemicism, fuzzy logic, supervaluationism, and contextualism, each offer valuable insights, suggesting that flexibility and nuance are essential in our reasoning. In the end, the puzzle urges us to be more aware of the gray areas in language, logic, and life. As we continue exploring this age-old problem, it remains a key topic in philosophical thought, challenging us to reflect, adapt, and embrace the richness of ambiguity.